To recapitulate, in our study of Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine, we have been in the chapter titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man, where Sri Aurobindo describes the emergence of the spiritual being out of the mental being as the next emergent step in human evolution. But to understand and appreciate the nature of that emergence and to be able to consciously participate in it, we have to first understand how we have come where we are. What are the stages or means by which the human mind has been brought by nature to a deeper awareness of the inner spiritual powers and potential within us. And Sri Aurobindo outlines 4 broad lines of development by which nature leads us to interiorize. The first is religion, second, occultism, third, spiritual philosophy, and fourth, the direct experience. You will see in the 4 a natural gradation. Religion, and especially in the way we know it today, tends to be more extroverted, more accessible in forms, and as a result tends to lose its deeper character. Occultism takes an inner poise primarily, turns to the powers within us and our latent potential, but may fall short of the spiritual by not going beyond the powers. Religion serves the purpose of helping us build a relationship with the divine in the universe or the divine beyond the universe. Occultism, in contrast, focuses attention on our own inner and perhaps higher potential of what we are or what we can become, powers latent which are drawn out to now participate in this larger evolutionary or spiritual unfoldment. The third, spiritual philosophy, centers itself more in the mind and includes and integrates the power of thought and the intellect into this spiritual change, and as a result prepares the mind for its own higher spiritual awakening, or to whatever extent it is able to move towards that. And the fourth, of course, is the very core and the purpose of this whole triple movement. It is the direct spiritual experience which, you may say, lives or fills these 3, or these 3 find their fulfillment in the fourth. But it seems as if the fourth can be had only if we have passed through these first stages. Each of these stages seems to take us closer towards the fourth. But in themselves, the stages are only preparatory and can even prevent us from moving ahead. In practice, as he describes, all 4 tend to mix into each other. In the portion we have been reading, he has described how religions emerged, what was the deeper basis of nature's attempt to form these religions. They started with an instinctive sense of the infinite, or the sense of an invisible presence, and then at the level of consciousness at which you begin to experience this, which is at first a more primitive, vital, instinctive consciousness, one begins to build relationships or a body of knowledge to access this presence felt, but still always at a low level. And once that is passed, a next greater stage, a stage 2, takes it to a much more developed poise of a higher knowledge, of which we have a better record today of the religions as we look back, going back a few thousand years, where there is a more advanced kind of a worship, cosmology, mythology, complex of ceremonies, practices, rituals, ethics woven in with the society, social systems. And in these, occultism is often there either as an add-on or as a superstructure. And the worship and the external forms of sacrifice or piety or social ethics are what dominate. He also takes the argument that perhaps it is from an occult experience that the religion emerges, and he explains, yes, that's possible and it can also happen, but the occult tendency will always tend to center in an individual or emerge out of an individual. Even where there is a collective experience, it is always through an individual that this experience emerges, and through that it grows and spreads into others. So there's always a starting point of a small individual or a small group out of which this emerges, and the intuitions may emerge as if from the external experience of something felt or an inner experience of something felt. But it is always the occultist and mystic element in the mind which creates, and that is to be found in individuals and not in the mass, that the change takes place at first. And having had this in a few, he says the fire is lit and spread from hearth to hearth, from altar to altar. And we saw last time the deeper significance of what this fire is, what the hearth is, and what the altar represents. We saw how this is a description of an inner state which reflects also in the social and forms of life outside. And he is always dwelling in all this description of this connection between the individual, microcosm, and the macrocosm, and how the two tend to reflect into each other. So we continue from that passage now, the last two sentences of this paragraph. He says, "But the spiritual aspiration and experience of the mystics was always cascaded in secret formulas and given only to a few initiates. It was conveyed to the rest, or rather preserved for them, in a mass of religious or traditional symbols. It is these symbols that were the heart's core of religion in the mind of an early humanity." If we read casually, it seems to be a more metaphorical description, but Sri Aurobindo never wastes words, and we have to pause and look deeper. The spiritual aspiration and experience of the mystics, and these mystics, remember, are a few in a society which is large, in a society which is not yet ready to share in the mystic's experience. What happens to such a mystic? We have known phases in human evolution where if someone revealed a power too great, too different from others, they were often cast out of society, feared, and sometimes killed. Because someone had a power too great and society couldn't risk being exposed to being controlled by someone who had such a great power, to be overwhelmed by something so great, or something so great which is feared, not understood, depending on the state of evolution. And the mystic naturally, even if society is accepting, finds himself living in a poise and experience so different from the norm that he has nobody with whom to share. And even if he tries to share, the words would mean nothing. There is the example of Plato's famous description of a caveman who spends all his life inside the cave in the darkness. Light is something which is created artificially, and he is only fascinated by his shadows, which is all he knows in the play of the light. If this caveman steps out, he finds himself overwhelmed by the brilliance of the sunlight. He is blinded by the light, unable to contain. If he grows to adapt to this greater light, entering the cave, he finds suffocating darkness and is unable to adapt to the darkness. How are the two to ever communicate? If the man who has seen the light enters the cave and says, "There is such a greater light and I can show you the way out," the people say you are a madman. Because there is only the shadow, light is only a side effect, the shadow is your reality. Light is created, not self-existent. Or whatever argument they may offer. But they fear if he comes with the power of that light, the brilliance of that illumination. And so necessarily the experience of the mystic is held back, protected. And here we get the sense of the casket. The casket tends to cover, to close in a way that you can no more see that which is within. It is generally used, the word is used to describe the box in which you store the most precious jewels, the riches. And again, as a symbol, the riches or the jewels is a Vedic symbol also. They represent not the physical value you give to things as when they are sold, but the nature of that substance, the very quality of that consciousness or that experience, which is something so precious. And like jewels, they could be lost or they could be conserved. Like jewels, they are immortal. And when worn, they tend to radiate their influence in the environment, impacting the circumstances. And so the jewels are always protected, they could be stolen, they could be lost, or they could be misused, or they could be thrown and wasted. And so the casket as if protects and hides from the eyes of the common man and prevents the thief from stealing by locking the casket. So implied in this use of the word casket is not only the protection but the ability to lock, and then you have the choice of whom you give the key. And this will become suddenly very obvious in the next part of the description. The key given, anyone can have access to the casket. You may open the casket and be overwhelmed by the brilliance of the light within and still be unable to access it, or you may bit by bit acclimatize and acquire the jewels and use them. The jewels also immediately draw a parallel to the sense of the chakras, the centers of consciousness within us, which are described variously as lotuses or as jewels. And because they have a natural color associated with their normal working, easily they correspond to physical jewels, rubies, emeralds, or other. Gold itself has a particular connotation with the higher supramental consciousness, which is seen as a golden. And so everything which is of the spiritual domain seems as if to reflect in some material form or symbol. And each of these jewels naturally evokes in you the sense of the chakras, and the chakras are the secret within you through which you have access to the totality of the universe. And this is casketed in your body as if unable to be seen but experienced from an inner sight. Casket also is used in a later usage to represent the box in which a person who has passed on is placed. And so you can see the suggestion of this. The body itself is as if the casket in which the jewels are hidden. So the spiritual aspirations and experience of the mystics was usually casketed in secret formulas. So the formulas now become the casket and given only to a few initiates. The moment you've put in the form of a formula which covers and conceals, you can show the formula, but people wouldn't understand. And what's the typical form of the formula as shown to others? It was conveyed to the rest, or rather preserved for them in a mass of religious or traditional symbols. We take a few examples. The most obvious here will be the symbols of the Vedic language. When the Vedic rishis speak of the fire, or they speak of the wind, or the sun, it seems as if they are talking about normal things of life, or things in nature. And they invoke the sun to clear the darkness. And a less developed mind would say, oh, these rishis, they are barbaric, they are so ignorant that they feel unless they call the sun won't rise. And you have people who have actually said that of the rishis, even within India, who declared them as barbarians who understood nothing and didn't understand the basic physics that the earth spins and so the sun has to rise. But that was not at all the case. For them, the sun, the physical sun itself, symbolized the divine consciousness radiating truth. The truth of the divine consciousness radiating its light. And so they spoke of not only the sun rising, dawning in our consciousness, but also the body of the sun, the substance of the sun, the ray of the sun. And when we look at it from below and look at this description, it looks like they are imposing on the sun certain images or symbols. So the ray of the sun is like a single ray which comes and touches you and gives you a flash of light. What's the big deal? Why give so much importance to a ray? You will see in the Egyptian tradition, which has a very strong symbolism of the Veda, the picture of the sun, and then a few rays which are drawn, and at the end of the ray is a hand. And the hand is holding the Ankh, the symbol of life, as they describe it. It's a cross with a circle on top. So it's the basis of what became later in Christianity, the cross or the Tau. And he's offering that. The ray is offering that. Or rather, the sun's arm is the ray ending in the hand which gives this. And on this side is the king or the priest. And they were often the same in the early Egyptian tradition, who would be the one competent enough to receive this or to relate to the sun. And you find exactly the same symbol in the Veda, not with this picturing, but the ray itself represents the light of the Supreme or the power of the Supreme in a single finite action. Whereas the sun represents the full infinity of the divine truth and knowledge and power. And if you take the symbolism and push it to its limit, the sun as a whole, as a sphere, has an infinity of rays. Between any two rays you will find an infinity of rays. And between any two of those you'll find an infinity. And you have literally the fullness of light glowing out, radiating, not as rays but as a full spread of the light. Infinity spreading out into infinity. Such is the nature of the experience of the divine truth. But to the human mind, which is unable to contain something infinite, we can only catch the sense of the ray, which has been filtered, which has been cut out. As when you're in a forest, from between the leaves you see a single ray, or a wider or narrower ray of light. And so, as the truth radiates, we catch a single ray. And the ray entering our finite and limited consciousness as a single piece represents truth as caught in a finite piece, and we call that intuition. And so the ray of sun was the intuitive consciousness. As it enters our mind, brings a flash of illumination to awaken knowledge. And the flash passes. The knowledge revealed, finite piece, that's all we have. And then another ray, and another finite piece, and another finite piece. So to the mind which is only able to handle finite pieces, you have series of flashes, of rays. If you do not know the sun as the source, then you have only the flashes, and they appear almost like a lightning, and so the image of lightning is used in the beginning. And then later that merges into the ray of the sun, which becomes now a streaming light of the intuition. But that's not enough to the Vedic Rishi. He has to rise along the ray to the sun itself and enter the gates of the sun. You will find in the South American or Central American tradition, in the Mayan tradition, there is the temple and there is the symbol with large stone structure which is called the gates of the sun. Now obviously if you go and see the stone piece, there's nothing of the sun, there's no fire, there's no light. Why is it called the gates of the sun? Because it was again the perception of this, the same symbol as the Vedic, which was represented in physical terms. So your entry into the temple and into the deepest part of the temple, the most sacred, which held the intense divine presence, well, as completely as we could invoke it, you passed through the gates of the sun. Or in the Vedic or later Upanishadic tradition, there is even the description of how passing through the gates of the sun one never returns. And it can be seen in two ways. You transcend the domain of mortality You never come back into mortality. It doesn't mean you end. You never return into mortality. Or it can be seen as a dissolution into the absolute and a liberation from the finite. But if you see it in the first way, you can of course re-enter the domain of divided or fragmented consciousness, but you are never fragmented. And so the gates of the sun had a great sense for the rishis. And then they describe the substance of the sun. You know the sun from its closeness, but you have not yet entered the substance of the sun. And it's only crossing the gates of the sun that you become one with that consciousness which is the divine truth. Unalloyed, unmixed, pure, infinite, indivisible one divinity. You're one with that from which the whole universe, the whole creation, as if bursts out. And now to be able to live in the sun. So the whole symbolism now is in fact a description of a spiritual experience which we discover corresponds perfectly with physical symbols. And to the Vedic experience, as you enter that consciousness of infinity and then turn towards the physical world, you see that these higher truths and their powers and relationships on the higher planes actually reflect on each of the planes below, forming an equivalent pattern reflected but on a denser substance, on a more reduced representation and symbol. To the Vedic vision, symbol was not merely a mental construction. Let's call the sun truth. Let's think of wind as a life energy. Well, it's not just a casual correspondence. It was rather a sight from above that saw how on each plane there was the representation of the truth of the sun, because each plane is a reduction of a higher plane of consciousness. And everything corresponding to it, essential to it, gets represented on the lower naturally, because it's a representation of the higher. But because it is lower substance, lower consciousness, greater limitation, the representation we call symbol. But it carries in it as if the seed, the core, or the link which can allow you to rise into the experience of the higher. So Sri Aurobindo defines symbol as truth of a higher plane represented on a lower plane. And when you catch the truth on the lower plane, it can be for you an entry point to experience the truth on the higher plane. And then we come to an extraordinary perception that as you go down the scale of the cosmos, of the planes of consciousness, all the way to the lowest, densest, most material domains, everything is as if a reflection or a formulation of things which were naturally free and true above, great truths above, which are infinite in a domain of infinity, now are represented as finite forms in a domain of finite forms. But the relationship of that truth, of the sun with the rays, is still reflected here with the physical sun and its rays. Or the relationship of the Vayu principle with the sun, the air principle with the sun, is reflected here by the physical air and the sun and their play, which may be seen purely in physical terms, as almost a physical cause and effect. Whenever the sun rises, it heats the air and begins a flow of air. Wherever the sunlight forms, it heats everything, brings light and gives life, and so on. Nourishes the plants. The whole source of all of our life processes we trace back to the sun. You could say, well, they saw this pattern and so gave to the sun this image, but that's an inferior understanding. The deeper truth is they experienced how the physical sun is a symbol of the supramental sun, and saw the life and the relationships to be merely physical representation of that. And then they saw how the powers flowing there would also be represented physically in physical forms. And they named the physical forms by those characteristic powers that they represent above, but also represent here. Horse, for example, became naturally a symbol of energy and the drive of energy. In one of the very old Upanishads, there is the description of the divine in the movement of manifesting, and it is described as the cosmic horse, whose eyes are the sun and the moon, and the if I remember right, the stars are the joints of the bones, and the hair of the horse is the plants of the earth, and so on. There's a direct correlation between what is described as a more essential energy, which is creative and moving, reflected here on earth, or with the physical world, with the physical cosmos, but with the use of the word horse. And the horse is described with the nose and its mouth open, which is Agni, fire, and the nose through which Vayu or air breathes, and so on. It's a Upanishad we have dwelt upon before. When we dwell on that symbolism, we find something so extraordinary, precisely describing the whole movement of this surging forward, manifesting energy, which leaves behind in its wake the past that fades away and looks towards the future as it forms the future. And something of this energy pushing forward, you see when a horse is running at great speed with its nose and head extended forward, and the energy, the quality of the energy of the horse is as if catching something of this. And so the horse is named Ashva, which in the etymology of the word comes from the which is existence, and Shva, which brings the force and energy and power. And so a horse is named by what is seen as a symbol in the vital planes, which is a symbol of the mental planes, which is a symbol of the spiritual domains of this and the spiritual energy which creates. Or the cow becomes a symbol of Go, is the name given, Gau for the plural. And Go as a word represents light, illumination, clarity, and is a natural symbol in the material body of the cow of that quality of the sattvic consciousness, of the purity and clarity and illumination natural to a higher, freer mind consciousness of the sattvic quality of the spiritual energy. And so the cow becomes naturally a symbol of, in the language, of that light. And the cows coming home becomes a symbol of the lights returning to their source, or the illumination. The cows moving out, the herd of cows which stream out from the sun. And it doesn't make sense if you take the physical symbol of it. How do the cows come from the sun? But that description can become the beginning of a mythological story. How the cows came from the sun, and as they moved, what happened, and so on. So we find behind the immediate narration, behind the symbol, certain profound spiritual experiences and truths, to which a physical symbol can be naturally given because there is such a correspondence. And then the rishi prays to the sun perhaps to give more cows and more horses. And when you say it in English, it sounds silly, but when you say it in Sanskrit, give me Go and Ashwa, give me light and that energy of manifestation. And you can understand it in physical terms as cows and horses, or if you listen to the Sanskrit in the etymology, the Sanskrit words, the rishi is saying, give me that illumination of knowledge and the power of that illumination of the spirit. And the result is that the initiates have the formula. They know that this is what we are speaking about, but to the rest, it was given, or it says rather preserved for them in a mass of religious or traditional symbols. And that's all the normal man hears. Oh, he's talking about cows and horses. You read the verses and you say cows and horses. But if the person has a readiness, he hears in the word Go, light, and not merely cow, because his mind has turned to the light and not the pastoral interests. Immediately there we see the distinction between who is ready to enter the spiritual domain and who is still in preparation for that entrance. And when the person comes who reads the line and says, this resonates deeply with me, the rishi knows, here's someone who is ready to be initiated. And if he seeks more, if he wants to enter deeper, the rishi gives him the key and shows him what is behind it. Or in the same way, as the spiritual movement grows within us, the Rishi experiences certain things internally which correspond to things externally in the cosmos. The mind and the power of the intellect and the lord of the intellect is described as Indra. And within us, we have the intellect and the center of intellect as the power that organizes the thoughts, takes the first impulsive emotions rising into thoughts and puts them in coherence, centering them around some reference of structure, logic, clarity. So in the cosmos, we find the maruts, the impulsive energies in the nature of the wind and forces of wind, which are otherwise chaotic in the storm. They are drawn together and gathered by the lightning and the thunder, which is at the center, and organized around it and perhaps become a hurricane or a storm. But this energy that organizes and puts them in right relation is Indra, whose characteristic are the lightning and the thunder, which in your mind becomes the light of knowledge, illumination, and the force of knowledge. And so you're using a double term of an internal description which has an external value, and it's not merely just a correlation, it is a symbol, again, in a limited individual of what is a cosmic working. And if it is a symbol, remember there's a link. So if in your mind you become conscious of this energy and awake into it and have full power over it, you feel that energy in the universe and can wield it through your mind's awareness. If you experience the energy of maruts and master it within you, you experience the power of the wind and the storm around you and have a control and mastery over it. Because they are connected. They are the same power working in a cosmic scale or individualized now and represented in our physical biological frame. And so there is a great power in this knowledge which also had to be protected. The awakened Rishi living in this reality where his consciousness was one with the universe experienced in his body the experiences in the universe of those powers, or rather experienced the universe as his body in which those powers played, and his physical body as a symbol and a smaller representation of that consciousness in which he lives. And for such a person, that language meant simultaneously the cosmic, the individual, and the correspondence between them. And when he chants the mantra of the Veda, it is as if he is sharing his experience of the cosmos. Too great, too intense, too far beyond a consciousness which is too small, too limited to even begin to understand what it means to live with the universe as your body. And so to them the verses are heard, understood in their limited capacity and terms, and yet they feel the resonance of the power of that experience. And they begin to value it, they treasure it. And in the dwelling of that experience, in the immersion of that experience, their consciousness is as if prepared, widened, and taken up closer to the experience. And so he uses this very interesting phrase, it was conveyed to the rest, or rather preserved for them, in a mass of religious or traditional symbols. It was conveyed, yes, but the real thing was not conveying, it was preserved. The experience was held in a way that even though you are not ready, you can have a touch of it, and the experience and the touch of that experience will prepare you for the fullness of the experience. So there were many traditions, many lineages in which the actual knowledge of the Vedic verses and the associated physical symbols, rituals representative of the inner growth were the means of the yoga. And to the deeper esoteric knowledge, the key was given that what you are doing externally is actually a symbol of what is within you. The fire you light is the aspiration within you. The clarified butter, the ghee that you pour into the fire, is the clarity of your intellectual consciousness, which you turn to that and give to it. And in the process, the fire purifies, lifts and transforms. The shape of the Yajna Kunda, the physical altar in which the fire is lit, had 3 steps corresponding to the 3 bodies, physical, vital and mental, of which the fire is the center, the soul, and the aspiration that glows out from the soul. To light the fire was to light the aspiration within you, or to become conscious of it. And initially, as you do the ritual, you may have no idea of what's happening within you, but as in the very nature of the symbol, something begins to resonate within you. And as you grow ready, you can be told, you see, this is what it represents. And as you light the fire, you're conscious of your aspiration. As you put the ghee, you're conscious of your psychological consciousness and your powers being merged into the flame of aspiration, consumed by it and purified, lifted by it. And in the space where the ritual takes place, there is someone who is asked to sit. He represents the witness. And his job is to do nothing and simply witness in equality. And you can see what that represents, something of the self presiding over this whole sacrifice of our life and the growth. And the whole of our life journey is seen almost as this sacrificial movement. The word in English, sacrifice, has a very negative connotation of loss of self in a negative way, of suffering. But here the word is yajna, which does not have that negative sense. It is the sacred fire and the ritual of the divine flowing into the divine through the means of the divine. And that's the way it is described by Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. And he says that one who lives in this lives in immersion to the divine. And in this symbol you realize every single action in the world emerges from the divine, is a quality or special expression of the divine, and flows into the divine. Or is consciously put by who? The divine. So the priest is a representation of an aspect of the divine who takes the material which is a representation of an aspect of the divine in an action which is itself an expression of the divine, put into the fire which is divine. And in this you see how you have to live your life. At the very essence, the process of the yoga itself. And so all these are profound insights, profound truths. And to a humanity which is not ready even to feel it is something too great, but easily represented in the ritual or in the outer form. And so, a mass of religious or traditional symbols, because you feel something in that, you preserve it. The rishis preserve it for you, you preserve it for the future generations, treasuring something which you don't quite know fully, but knowing that it has helped you, you wish it to be helped by others, or knowing that it has a great spiritual truth that you are not yet able to fully experience, you preserve it. And this is how the Vedic tradition, although transmitted only orally, could survive at least 10,000 years without any corruption. And they had other means by which they preserved even the knowledge with certain complex patterns by which there was a self-correction, which we see in modern communications, that when there's a transmission from your mobile phone to the tower, there's a pattern of signals and then there is an encoding around it, so that if the signals are corrupted, you will detect in the encoding and be able to reconstruct. And something of that is built into the Vedic verses themselves. And then there are fascinating correspondences which do not seem to have been done intentionally. You take certain chapters of the Vedic verses, count the number of verses, and they correspond to the number of days of rotation of planets in our solar system around the sun. So it's as if these successive chapters are encapsulating a knowledge or correspond to or resonate with the planetary movements in our solar system around the sun. What's the connection? And then you enter into a whole domain of symbolism of what the solar system is. Microcosm of the cosmos, mesocosm would be the word we may use, and the link of astrology with the human being and how the powers correspond to powers within us and so on, and how those rhythms reflect within us. But in the verses, what we discover is these verses are directed to certain deities. And so it's as if those planets are embodiments or representations or physical condensations of those deities. It gives you a deep insight. Every sun, being a physical symbol of the divine truth, would have around it planets representing these deities, which are also aspects of the divine. There's a very interesting statement Sri Aurobindo makes in one of the letters. He says, every solar system has 13 planets. I don't know the context. I don't know what is asked because we don't have the letter which was asked, the question asked of him. We also find in some of the unusual literature, in one of somebody who was a contactee for beings coming from other planets, George Adamski, very famous at one time in the 50s. Very beautiful photos that he has taken of the flying crafts. He was told by those beings that every solar system has 13 planets. So it's there in his book independently, it is there in Sri Aurobindo's writing independently, earlier than Adamski, and surely Adamski hasn't read Sri Aurobindo or wouldn't have given it value. And there's some suggestion there that these 13 are not by chance. They represent or become physical embodiments of these powers of the divine. If the sun has to manifest, naturally it brings with him his whole retinue of powers, cosmic, psychological powers, and gives them body, gives them form. And so suddenly everything in the universe is a symbol. And maybe all these powers are not fully manifested, but they're still latent or in a process of manifestation. And all this leads us to a very deep experience or vision of the spiritual reality. The physical world itself is seen as if a embodiment, body of the divine, but in a very reduced, in a very limited, in a very densified, materialized substance which cannot carry the fullness of the truth and loses it, conceals it, even distorts it. But if that consciousness is its origin, that consciousness is also hidden within and can be drawn out, called out, or activated, and emerging from within, it can transform these appearances and reveal the divinity concealed. And the part of the universe in which this process has been most developed by evolution is the human being, isn't it? Within us, not only we are conscious that we are conscious, but we are capable of becoming conscious of the divinity concealed within us. And so we are able to participate in drawing out its possibilities, in its emergence, and eventually in its full revelation in the body and through the body equally, as much as in our subtler gradations of consciousness and bodies. So, all this is too much to teach, or if taught, would be easily lost or desecrated or reduced, as you can see happening today in so much of what is taught in yoga, that deep spiritual symbols are taken and perverted even to justify crude, coarse impulses and practices or desires. And so the need to protect. In the next paragraph, which unfortunately we won't have enough time to enter today, he says, when this movement of nature is to spread the knowledge, which comes in the third phase of religion, he says, there is the strong spiritual nucleus became mixed, diluted, alloyed. It tended to be invaded and aped by the lower elements of mind and life and physical nature. It was this mixture and alloy and invasion of the spurious, this profanation of the mysteries and the loss of their truth and significance, as well as the misuse of the occult power that comes by communication with invisible forces, that was most dreaded by the early mystics and prevented by secrecy, by strict discipline, by restriction to the few fit initiates. So this is the problem. This knowledge is not just a beautiful spiritual experience, it is also a power. A power to wield, to influence the environment, to influence others. a power to draw upon those spiritual potencies and actuate them in the physical world through the symbol, or your body, your consciousness being the most developed symbol of the divine, your mind, your will acting. I've heard interesting stories from people who have wandered around and seen or interacted with these spaces. One of them used to say he was living for a few days with a yogi who was living in the forest all alone, and every now and then he needed to cook his food. How do you light fire? You can buy matches from a local store, but you don't find that in the forest. So he would say a mantra and throw a stick into the arrangement of other sticks, and with the mantra as he threw the stick, there would be a fire that would light. Easy. Keeps it simple. You don't have to carry a matchbox. You want to put out the fire, you don't have to carry water. You can use the mantra or just blow it with your breath. But this kind of an action, this freedom to be able to act, you can imagine how easily it could be misused. Or if you had the ability to teleport, you want to carry an object. Well, it's too much to carry it with you. You hide it in a cave. And when you need it while you're in your forest practice, you pull it out of the cave and bring it into your hand. Not a very big deal for a consciousness which feels that space of the cave as if in his own hand anyway. So just you reach out and pull it out and it's here. And what happens if someone wants to misuse it today? You reach out into a bank and catch the cash and transfer it into your pocket. Or you push a knife into somebody's body far away. Any kind of misuse is possible. Any engagement with invisible forces allows for misuse. What are the things which would prevent misuse? First, he says secrecy. The deeper aspects of the utilization of these powers is held back, or even in certain traditions shunned. They will only hold the pure spiritual content of it, and the occult implications of the same Vedic verses are set aside, forgotten, suppressed. Or second, by strict discipline. Unless you follow this discipline, you will not be given this knowledge, and only if you follow this discipline that you become worthy of the knowledge. And that discipline being sufficiently set, it is difficult to misuse. One of the ways in which the discipline was enforced in the context of India, a seeker of knowledge was taught from the very beginning not to have any sense of possession. You own nothing. And you have to develop humility. Now, there are many aspects to this. The humility itself is a necessity if you are to receive a higher knowledge. You cannot claim or seize higher knowledge. You can only receive. And if the poise of consciousness of humility is not developed in all the parts of your being, the transmission of the higher knowledge would never be made complete, or would be lost in transmission or distorted in transmission. So humility in your whole being. And so all your life discipline was designed to bring humility, selflessness, and so on. It went to the extent that every evening you would go and beg for food, beg for alms, and people gave what they gave, you took without question. Equality. And no particular desire, freedom from desire. All of these things were impressed. It didn't mean that you had to stay that way all your life, but that was part of the initial phase of education, especially during the formal study years. All children would go through that phase of asking for food. It's interesting today, it still remains in many of the ascetic traditions where the monks go and beg for food, and it's almost like a performance. They walk in a line, go house to house. Not so much in India, but you'll see that in the Southeast Asian countries, in Thailand and other places. In India, it has now reduced. You don't find people doing that, but it's reduced to a mere ritual. At the age of 12, a young man is given the initiation of the mantra, and the sacred thread is put, which is for him like a new birth. You can call it an initiation into the spiritual or the new life as an adult and independent being. But with that, he goes through the exercise. His head is shaved, he wears the special clothes, unstitched, again a symbol, no division, no fragmentation, single piece. And then he has to go and ask for alms. And it's done as a ritual. The fellow goes, asks for alms, eats, and the ritual is over. He takes off those clothes, puts on his usual stitched clothes, goes back to his normal life. The ritual still may have a certain impact, but it's mostly lost. But we see why the strict discipline was necessary. And discipline means control over your thoughts and your emotions and your desires and your instincts. That in a moment of anger, you may not exercise your power to harm another and then regret later. So the discipline had many other aspects, that you have complete self-control, that you are able to now be worthy of this power. And by restriction to the few fit initiates, so often going through many layers of testing for fitness and progressively giving them access to the deeper knowledge or the implied powers which came with it, and only those who were fit were taken into the inner circles. We had a discussion about this last time, and how inevitably in the decline of the age you have less and less fit people. And so either the knowledge is lost, or eventually someone comes into it who has now the tendency to misuse. And again with that the knowledge is lost eventually. So unavoidable. So I reread now the sentence we were at. But the spiritual aspiration and experience of the mystics was usually cascaded in secret formulas and given only to a few initiates. It was conveyed to the rest, or rather preserved for them, in a mass of religious or traditional symbols. And you see now the importance of this cascading and the formulas being kept secret. And it's not merely formulas of power, but also formulas of the spiritual truths. In the Abrahamic tradition, you will find some of these symbols also represented in many stories in mythological forms, of which today the deeper spiritual sense is completely forgotten. And because I've dwelt on some of these examples, it is useful to look at their equivalents. In the Jewish tradition, there is the celebration on the sacred day of a lamp which is made of 7 candles, 7 lights, the Hanukkah, I believe. And there is one central stem, and then that splits into 7. Very symbolic. Why 7? If you look it up today in the Wikipedia or some such commonly accessible text, then they will say, oh, because of 7 days that God took to create the world. Why did God take 7 days to create the world? Oh, yeah, that's the story. The myth, and it's lost in the myth. If you now look at the deeper knowledge, and you find the key in the yoga tradition which still preserves this, the divine in manifestation undergoes a process of, let's say, an expression to manifest cosmos involves 7 principles, which make for the 7 planes of the cosmos. The upper 3 being always held in a consciousness of unity that knows multiplicity but without losing unity. The lower 3 knowing only multiplicity, the unity being lost. And the in-between, which knows both unity and multiplicity, what is called the supramental. And the lower 3 is our physical, vital and mental. Unity is there, we don't know it, it's behind. If it was not there, we would be in chaos. But 7, 3, 3 and 1 in between, which links the 3. Now when the Hanukkah was made, you could have put all 7 as if in a circle. But they put it in a straight line. And the one in the center is as if the stem, the one starting which splits into 7, goes straight through the middle and represents the supramental, the 3 on one side, the 3 on the other side, the link between the upper and the lower hemisphere. And it's the continuity of the stem, the most powerful, the central, the sun of the supramental consciousness. And you see the resonance again. It's very interesting. And the way it is represented physically, you can catch the feel of that symbolism. But perhaps something of this still remains in the very secret traditions of the core of the rabbinical orders, perhaps. But in the formal external conveyance, there is only a traditional symbol. It's a ritual, a religious form, and that's it. It stops there. It corresponds, of course, equally to the 7 chakras within us. So as you light the 7 flames of the Hanukkah, you are lighting the 7 chakras within you. As a result of which your consciousness as if opens out to the oneness of the divine presence. And the symbol and the rest of the ritual then follows, which would have equally a profound symbolism, which I'm not familiar with. But many symbols continue. And you could ask, how do they survive? If nobody really knows what they mean, and people just go through it. Because somewhere in that symbol, somewhere in that ritual, you experience the lift, the sense of transition that it leaves you with. You go through the ritual, you come away, something has changed. And even though you cannot articulate the change always, you want to ensure that it is preserved because you feel something hidden in it. And you feel something hidden in it because the physical symbol, however much your surface consciousness does not understand, resonates in your deeper and higher parts. And that's the whole point of the symbol. And so it was conveyed to the rest, or rather preserved for them, in a mass of religious or traditional symbols. It is these symbols that were the heart's core of religion in the mind of an early humanity. Heart's core of religion in the mind of an early humanity, and you have to dwell on that sense. To that mind now turning to understand, to experience, it has come to a level where the intelligence is engaged with the religious form. So to the mind, what's the core of the religion? And you go to something which resonates with an experience. And that depth of that core, the heart of the religion and then the core of the heart, is here in these secret formulas and profound symbols. From there is the heart of the religion, which is perhaps held in the living experience by a few. And from there is the radiance into the collective, to whatever extent. So, out of this second phase of evolution, now comes the third. So the next paragraph we now take up. Out of this second stage, there emerged a third which tried to liberate the secret spiritual experience and knowledge and put it at the disposal of all as a truth that could have a common appeal and must be made universally available. Must be made universally available. Why? Because in the evolution we have now come to a stage where we say, how can this be held back? Humanity as if feels a readiness, and those who hold the knowledge feel that it is not fair to hold back when the mass is more ready, and must be made universally available. And the secret spiritual experience and knowledge must be liberated. It's bound up too tightly, held back, and put at the disposal. Let all benefit, let all grow. A tendency prevailed not only to make the spiritual element the very kernel of the religion, but to render it attainable to all the worshippers by an exoteric teaching. And so two things are happening. The spiritual element now becomes the focus. Why are we doing what we do? And you turn to highlight the core. And at the same time, you have to render it attainable by a teaching which is spread to the masses. Esoteric, that which is held by a few. Exoteric, that is which is given out and spread out. And so there is a double movement. A turning inward and then a turning outward, with the experience somewhere in between. Render it attainable to the worshippers by an exoteric teaching. They can't yet get it. How can we render it attainable? How will you do that? Speak of it, make them go through the experience and hope that it will catch on somehow, or speak of the deeper symbols, give rituals, and you will find this is the form that has happened before but is happening again today. In the North American region, the practices of going to a sweat lodge, for example, or going out into nature for 3 days and 3 nights to find your answer, to find yourself, to find your purpose, whatever the cause. That is still being recovered in some way, often with some distortion, and that's part of the problem we will see later. But at least the attempt is made now to make it accessible. There are those who decry that communalization. You're losing the whole point of it if you do it in this way. On the other hand, those who want to do it, they say, yes, but if you don't do it, what happens to the others? And you have a tug between them. In rendering it attainable, you're of course rendering it. It's no more the same thing. So there is a reduction and a loss with it. As each esoteric school had its system of knowledge and discipline, so now each religion was to have its system of knowledge, its creed, and its spiritual discipline. Remember the esoteric schools as if forming a core within the religious framework. So now, as it was here, the same happens with the religion. The religion was to have its system of knowledge, its creed, and its spiritual discipline. You will see in the church, for example, in the Catholic Church, the discipline which is given to the priests, very specific, very rigorous and rigid. That then the tendency then to exaggerate it and then to try to impose that on others or to discard those who cannot meet that rigid standard. And in order as if to highlight the difference, the standard becomes more rigid, more intolerant of tiny failures. And then of course in the mass there is an attempt to break away, to take something of this but in a more plastic, more flexible form, and all the rest which you see in the history. Here, in these two forms of the spiritual evolution, the esoteric and the exoteric, the way of the mystic and the way of the religious man, we see a double principle of evolutionary nature. Now this is happening not merely by historical causes, but it is happening by a deeper spiritual principle behind. And he is now showing that. The point we have to recognize, because there is a deeper spiritual principle which with two sides, this will happen everywhere. Not only in humanity, in every culture, in every religion, but on any planet where religion emerges in a conscious evolution. Because it corresponds to a principle in nature. So what is the principle? The double principle of evolutionary nature. The principle of intensive and concentrated evolution in a small space, and the principle of expansion and extension, so that the new creation may be generalized in as large a field as possible. Nature is doing this all the time. She takes a concentrated space or a concentrated group of individuals in which through her pressure she intensifies certain powers, knowledge, experiences, elements of culture and refinement. Once sufficiently developed and perfected, there is this other movement, principle of expansion and extension, so that it may be generalized in as large a field as possible. And the second movement tries to reach out as widely as possible. The attempt is to go to the maximum. But he uses two words in this expansion: expansion and extension. In the expansion phase, that which is there simply widens out. It cannot expand beyond a point. At that point it extends. And in the extension it is no more the same fullness of experience, but a content of it which is as if pushed out. In the expansion there is an in-to-out pressure. In the extension there is only the outward pressure that is left. You're actively spreading it. So King Ashoka, when he converted to Buddhism, he said, oh, this which I have discovered is so great, I want everybody to share in it. So he has the edicts which he formalizes and then sends out what he calls the teachers of righteousness, teachers of dharma, who are sent out in all directions to spread the teaching. And that is the extension. It is no more expansion. And at that point the teachers go and teach and push as widely as possible, and of course with it great reduction, dilution, diversification and adaptation to local spaces. All of this would be part of the extension, whereas expansion would still contain broadly the impulse which is still naturally felt, resonates as it spreads out. At the same time, nature gathers to concentrate, intensify in a small space, and at the same time she expands and extends so that this new creation may be generalized in as large a field as possible. Now, these two movements may happen at the same time. More often we see them in succession. So, first there is a concentration in history. It is built strongly enough, and then there is this outburst, spreading out. The concentration is never lost, that still retains, and in it a further concentration may continue while the expansion goes on. Or the concentrated space weakens by the very force of its expansion and extension, and now loses something of it, and the exaggeration is on the expansion and extension, and the core seems to fail. Or after a while nature says, now I have diluted too much, and again a concentration, but no more necessarily in the same space. It could be in many different centers that she builds a concentration. And then from there again an expansion and extension. But this dual principle of nature and the alterations, even when they are simultaneous, the alteration of emphasis is nature's method, and so necessarily everywhere. Now, when we say everywhere, it is not only in the context of religion, it is in the context of everything else, of culture, of any kind of development, of any technology, of any new habit, of any evolution, including not only psychological evolution but physical evolution. So in the physical evolution, there would have been a time when nature concentrates on a few apes, intensifies the urge to push awareness into mind and thinking mind and self-awareness. And it may happen in one tiny cluster, and the apes rapidly grow into this, and there is this awakening into knowledge, and the consciousness, now separated sufficiently from the body, turns upon the body and can hold its own. And with it, the influence acts on the body itself to change the body rapidly, and you have as if the breaking out of the human crude form. And then once this is achieved by resonance, it spreads out into all. We spoke last time or the time before of the 100th monkey principle, where once a species attains a sufficient stability of a new habit or consciousness, it ripples into the species consciousness. So it could be a transmission in that way, horizontally in consciousness, or transmission through physical form and conveyance. The truth of transmission by direct resonance of consciousness is far more effective in the domain of the mind. And there you do not need to have species, individuals wandering to spread and teach. And that's why in the human consciousness today, a small group developing a new consciousness or a new awakening, or even deepening their aspiration and sense of spiritual purpose, can have an enormous ripple effect on all of humanity. And much more rapidly than before, because everywhere in humanity there is a seeking, but without awareness of what it is seeking. And that's why a space like Auroville, or the ashram, or other conscious spiritual communities can be acting with great power in the world without anyone knowing about it. And if they are conscious of this influence, the action can be even more potent. The mother spoke of it openly. She said that the ashram in that context was like a special representation of humanity, and all the types of humanity and their typical problems were represented here to be solved in a concentrated spiritual effort by the spiritual action. And she said wherever the breakthrough was made in change of consciousness, it had enormous repercussions in humanity, because that change would ripple out, and those people would find it easy now to change. Or the action of the spiritual on that knot having succeeded, the spiritual action in the collective would be able to dissolve that knot or change it naturally, more easily. There were many examples of people here who were very troublesome, who not only were troubled internally but were troublesome to the community. And so many said, well, why didn't you just send out this person? And mother said, you don't understand how important it is, the work that is being done in him. And if it succeeds, it will be such a great help for humanity. Sometimes it succeeded, sometimes it seemed to fail. And what is interesting in the way it works, if the person leaves and now ceases to participate consciously, someone else who has a similar tendency finds that tendency exaggerated in him, because it is as if the consciousness in nature, in humanity, now concentrates into this person to say, here, I need this to be fixed. If not through that body, through this body. And suddenly he feels his problem intensifying. And equally the spiritual action can work upon it, and through him on humanity. So it's something very interesting. It does not happen everywhere. But it happens where there is a conscious gathering of people for a spiritual purpose, that automatically the consciousness of humanity leans into this group to participate and to receive the spiritual light and to participate in that accelerated evolution. So when you start, it seems like, oh, we are such fine people, we will never have a problem. And as you grow very rapidly, suddenly problems tend to exaggerate and appear within us. What happened? We were so fine together when we started. But if we recognize what it represents, we can consciously understand, yes, this intensified difficulty in me is my way of helping humanity, or participating, or nature pushing, leaning into me to push this problem to be resolved. Which is what you see in Auroville. When numbers are small, the exaggeration of the problems is sharper. So when numbers were in the hundreds or so, the mother said, you have a lot of problems, isn't it? And she said, wait for the number to grow a little more. Once you're about 20,000, all these problems will go away. Because then the problem impulse is spread out into a few, and it's not as sharply felt. If we were just 5, it's as if 5 have to represent the burden of those problems of humanity. It seems too sharp. When you're 500, then it's already dissolved into 100-fold, so to say. And with different degrees and gradations. Some in whom a point is acute, in others it is a more dulled aspect, and so on. But we here understand a deeper working of nature. Remember, it's always nature doing it in us until we come into our own as a conscious practitioner. There is the subconscious yoga of nature, and then the conscious individual yoga that takes over from there. So at that point, nature is pushing for this widening and for the concentration. So wherever the opportunity comes and people become open to the concentrated effort, nature pushes herself and the problems necessary to be fixed in them, through them. Equally, she evokes in a few who are ready the impulse to spread out. And when Ashoka would have sent out his emissaries, it's not enough that he orders, you go. There has to be someone who's competent, and among the competent there are those who would volunteer and say, yes, I feel the urge to spread, and I'm willing to take the strain and the struggle of going great distances. And the impulse within them as if turns to accept this need. Or rather, if you understand the way nature works, she builds vehicles who are now ready for this when the time comes for the spreading. And then she activates them, and suddenly there is this movement. If she understands nature's working, she is looking ahead. Because she knows what she wants to do. She is looking ahead. Not only in a few years, but decades and sometimes thousands of years. You will remember the mother's observation that for her body to be constructed, to be ready for the work that she had to, the consciousness she had to bring into it and the work to be done, it took nature about 2,000 years to gather the material. Now nature would not do that for just one body. She would make multiple centers and then use that which is most ready at the time when it's necessary. And then mother says, when it's time for me to leave my body, when I have to leave it, it will take me about 6 months to put back into nature that material which has been gathered. So the gathering of material is not only in the physical part, in the psychological body is also a certain very refined and plastic and complex mix. When you see in her heredity, in the lineage, there are branching out into 4 different directions, from 4 different cultures, from 4 different traditions, and even specializations of religious or genetic types. But when finally coalescing in her mother, there is suddenly no religious form given. but with a body which has imbibed all the best that those religious trainings and disciplines and spiritual culturings could have brought. And so one sees in nature a kind of a foresight of which we are unable to fully appreciate. And even as you see the confusions in the world today, if you could see what nature is trying to do through that confusion, you would say, yes, this makes so much sense. And some of this he is describing here. In this passage particularly, he reveals nature's processes. We have seen earlier also another sentence which had come, on which we dwelt for quite a while, where he said, "This is everywhere the process of nature, and to ignore it is to miss the intention in her works and get lost in the maze of her procedure." You remember that line which we had gone on to. And that was there where the emergence of a new consciousness, how it turns and confirms itself, secures against relapse and downward gravitation, failure and extinction, but it has then to stabilize into its full self-achievement and develop into utmost height and subtlety, richness and wideness. It has to become dominant, all-embracing, comprehensive. But it has emerged from a lesser grade. So that whole process of emergence and how it has to stabilize itself was a description of how the mind emerges out of a lesser grade of consciousness, or the spiritual consciousness emerges out of the lesser mind. And if in the vocabulary that Sri Aurobindo uses on the first emergence of this spiritualized mind, he calls it the mind of light, which is able to experience freedom from ignorance, although in finite and limited degrees. But that mind of light goes through two phases, one of assembling its powers, and when sufficiently concentrated, it comes into its own now, recognizing itself, and now amplifying and developing itself to protect against relapse and so on, the passage I read. And if you get stuck with procedures of nature, you get confused. If you look at the intention, you can see this happening everywhere. And through many different processes, because nature is not bound to a single process. So this is a very interesting chapter where all these processes in evolution he is showing you. And as we've always said, it is universally true across all planets, across all cultures, across all religions also in this case. So the double principle of evolutionary nature, intensive concentrated evolution in a small space, and the generalized extension, expansion to reach as large a field as possible. Now he elaborates on this. The first is the concentrated, dynamic and effective movement. The second tends towards diffusion and status. In diffusion, what happens? Something of what you have enters a different material. In physical terms, diffusion would be a gas diffusing into another, or colored water diffusing into the mass of water, or salt diffusing into water until everything becomes saline. The nature of diffusion, in this example of salt or color, is that everywhere it gets spread out. But the substance into which it spreads largely keeps its character. And the color, the teaching, the spiritual experience is filling it in a mix. And that's the problem of the second tendency, diffusion, and with its status, it wants to fix itself, stabilize, and this is what I am, I won't change. Get into some diffused state, and then that becomes now the norm and status to bring stability. In contrast, the first is concentrated, dynamic and effective movement. It is always in change. It has to dynamize in concentration and to be effective, and it measures its effectivity and optimizes itself for effectivity. And the other, slow diffusion, stabilization, fixity. As a result of this new development, the spiritual aspiration, at first carefully treasured by a few, became more generalized in mankind. But it lost in purity, height, and intensity. We will see this in some of the old cultures, old traditions, many of which have died out. In Egypt, for example, you find the priestly class protecting the spiritual content, the king being often the chief priest, or later when there is a separation, the king becomes a symbolic center, but the priest who does the active engagement is someone else. And there already you see the spirituality separating from the form, knowledge separating from the power, and a division has occurred. Inevitable again, because in the domain of mind, knowledge and power appear to be separate faculties. But in the origin, the one who lived the experience was also the powerhouse of the experience and influence. And then later, people look up to the priests, look up to the king, but go on with their normal lives. Occasionally, special events where there's revelation of a presence, a light spread, or simple rituals given every morning. Look at the sun, offer water to the sun, speak your mantra, and go back to your mechanical life. Little bit more, but at some point it breaks out of that boundary, and you want everybody to participate, and that becomes the more generalized teaching. What you see today as religions in the world and the practice of religions is the result of this dissipation. With it though, with a generalized form, you have three things: loss of purity, loss of height, loss of intensity. When the person does, let's say, the formal ritual, what are you doing it for? So that I will gain good luck, so that I will grow in my business, so that I will succeed in my desires for love or for comfort or for security or protection, whatever it is. Why do you do your prayer? Why do you go to the temple? Well, since I've started going to the temple, my business has grown so much. I get some peace of mind at the end of the day. I'm not so much troubled. I sleep better. Something which is about satisfaction of your current priorities, and it has nothing to do with the spiritual. Or loss of height. You have an experience and an uplift. I feel good whenever I go to the temple. I feel this peace and joy and calm. And it stops there. I don't need more. What about entering the peace of infinity and the knowledge which is infinite and the bliss which is infinite? Ah yes, after I retire from my life. Right now I want to enjoy my life. So the enjoyment of this is more important. Satisfaction of my lower triple sheaths, bodies, is the priority, and that is felt as a distant call for which you're not ready. This is the priority. And then loss of intensity. I feel a little bit. If it becomes too much, it's scary. I can't contain it. And it actually happens to people when they feel the experience to grow in intensity, they stop. I remember it was only recently, last year, we were in a program in the United States, and we did a certain practice for concentration on the peace and descent of peace as a group. And afterwards there was a lady who came. She said, I've been practicing so many things, a whole list of things. And she said, when the descent began, it was so intense, I immediately stopped it. I thought it was a contraindication. I said, what do you mean? It was too intense, so it's something must be wrong. The assumption was an intensity beyond your normal experience is a sign that you're not ready, or it should not be done, or there's some danger. And she completely closed and stopped it. Why? Because it came from an assumption that your normal state is your norm, and a little bit on it, some play of higher or deeper thing, is spirituality. Elsewhere in the Synthesis of Yoga, Sri Aurobindo says that mankind is satisfied with a modicum of spirituality. A little bit of joy, a little bit of peace, a little bit of satisfaction, a little bit of light and something felt, undescribable, and that's all. You go back to your little world, rejuvenated. In another experience from some people who were traveling from the ashram, the group which they were meeting, they said, oh, it's so valuable when they come. After you come, we feel uplifted, And for the next 2 or 3 months, we can go on with our life with great energy. And the question put was, well, what about the point of that uplift? You're not interested in that. You're not interested in deepening and growing in that consciousness. You want to just take that in a rush to be able to live your life with greater enthusiasm and enjoyment. And one wonders what value it has. Of course, it has a preparatory value. But from the perspective of the concentration of a few, you have this loss in purity, loss in height, loss of intensity. The mystics founded their endeavor on a power of supra-rational knowledge, intuition, inspired revelatory, and on the force of the inner being to enter into occult truth and experience. But these powers are not possessed by men in the mass, or possessed only in a crude, undeveloped and fragmentary initial form in which nothing could be safely founded. So for them, in this new development, the spiritual truth had to be clothed in intellectual forms of creed and doctrine, in emotional forms of worship, and in a simple but significant ritual. At the same time, the strong spiritual nucleus became mixed, diluted, alloyed. It tended to be invaded and aped by the lower elements of mind and life and physical nature. It was this mixture and alloy and invasion of the spurious, this profanation of the mysteries and the loss of their truth and significance, as well as the misuse of occult power that comes by communication with invisible forces, that was most dreaded by the early mystics and prevented by secrecy, by strict discipline, by restriction to the few fit initiates. I'm reading on so we get the full picture of what follows. Another untoward result or peril of the diffusive movement and the consequent invasion has been the intellectual formalization. You give form in intellect and then lose the whole force of the freedom of the experience. Intellectual formalization of spiritual knowledge into dogma, and the materialization of living practice into a dead mass of cult and ceremony and ritual. A mechanization by which the spirit was bound to depart in course of time from the body of the religion. Why would you do this? And so the last sentence, but this risk had to be taken, for the expansive movement was the inherent necessity of the spiritual urge in evolutionary nature. So within the spiritual urge in nature, she is trying to draw humanity by these fourfold tracks into the deeper spiritual awakening. Inherent to that necessity was this widening, expansive movement. To be able to have the expansion, she had to have a first concentration in which something special could be built. But the expansion was always implied to be followed later, because otherwise you cannot complete this awakening of humanity to the higher spiritual transition from mind to the spiritual being, or from a lower grade of mind to the higher grade of intellectual mind, and so on. But always the push of the spiritual needs this and accepts the risk of all these distortions. Now the full sense of all this, which I have just read rapidly, the difference between the nature of the experience of the initial mystics who built it on an supra-rational knowledge, intuition, inspiration, revelation, what these are, what these mean, and in what way it was the basis of all their work, and the inner being entering into occult truth and experience, contrasting with a mass of humanity still crude, undeveloped, which can only catch initial forms in which nothing can be established safely. This contrast is what you see, and especially in that last phase of the cycle of religion, which we see, let's say, about 2000 years ago everywhere in the world, where suddenly there was this decline in the spreading out into the masses. And we'll dwell upon that with many examples. Why is that important? Because today humanity has risen largely from that very crude stage, an undeveloped and fragmentary stage. Where today a larger mass, and we won't say all, but still a larger mass, even a majority of the mass of humanity can receive something of this light if it chooses to. It's capable of it. Does it want it? Maybe not. And that's where the crisis in the current circumstances, where as if the survival of humanity is at stake, the crisis is compelling people to find a deeper solution. Where when all surface solutions fail, we turn instinctively to the deeper solution. But for that we have to pass through the breakdown where all solutions are attempted and allowed to fail, before we realize that it's not by outer means, by change of systems, by change of rituals, by change of forms of organization, that the problem will be solved. It will be a change of consciousness. And what will that change be? And we turn within and try to find what we need to change. And of course we start with you have to change, but eventually I have to change to show you how you have to change, and all that follows. But this is the current phase where the change is possible. How many in humanity are waking up? We'll discuss that in greater detail next time. But that awakening is there, and a readiness to awaken is there in larger masses. What spirituality means to them, though, may be still very reduced. And I want to share with you something which appeared in the newspaper just this morning. It is from a very famous teacher. I won't name him. And his name is there here, and his picture, and his teaching. And the article has this very interesting quotation. It says, when I speak of spiritual journey, the immediate assumption is I'm encouraging people to look for God. But even God is a conclusion. The obsession with conclusion is inculcated in our most impressionable years. And so he goes on, who is God, what, and all that stuff. And finally he comes to, spirituality is not about looking for God, truth, or the ultimate. It is about enhancing your perception, your very faculty of seeing. And there you have the whole of spirituality reduced to enhancing your capacity to see. And suddenly you wonder, is this spirituality at all? And yet in the mass teaching that the movement aims to reach, if you say you must realize an ultimate consciousness or deeper truth or God, whatever vocabulary you may use, and they correspond to different experiences of the divine, most people are not interested. You can't build a mass movement. In order to build a mass movement, you have to minimize expectation from the followers. Do this ritual 5 minutes every day and you're part of my group. And all the benefits will come naturally to you, and all your desires will be fulfilled, and all your whatever promises. And you have a little bit of spirituality. That's the modicum. How many movements will you find in the world which declare self-realization as their goal? In the West, the only one I know of is Self-Realization Fellowship, founded by Paramahansa Yogananda, which declares self-realization as the goal. It's Self-Realization Fellowship. How many followers really aim at that, one could still question, but at least the movement declares itself in those terms. I don't know of any other which has, maybe they have different vocabulary, but aiming at that as the primary goal. And again in India, you don't find too many with that declared goal. Or if they are, they're so small, so few in numbers, that you rarely hear about them in newspapers or in headlines. The ones that come in large numbers, which are popular as a movement and rapidly grow, are the ones who have dimmed and diluted to that level, where it's reduced to self-development, so that you can enrich your life and enjoy it better. Self-development is not spiritual development. Self-development stops with amplifying your current powers to be able to exercise their use in life just a little more, to fulfill your current goals of desires or enjoyments. Spiritual development changes all these fundamentally. So this is to understand, and the risk and the utility even in this dilution we have to recognize. They help the larger mass move one step up. And having moved one step up, they realize there is a little more and can move another step, and each step may grow slightly faster. And at some point, a larger part of humanity will say, yes, there is something more. And while it may take time, while it may not be my immediate priority, that's the direction in which I want to grow. And a true change within, a spiritual change, begins. So we are in this very interesting transition today in the world. And as we dwell on these lines next time, we will appreciate better the nuances and the hints which he shares here. But the next session will be on Sunday after 2 weeks. It will be on the 9th of February, as I'll be traveling in between. For those who are coming here regularly, we will still show a video of other talks, and you're welcome to join at the same time to keep the mood of the study. But we will pause here and dwell upon what within us, in our own consciousness, corresponds to this movement of gathering, concentration, and the movement of spreading and dilution. Within us, we are also a people. We are also a community of so many parts in the human being. Which is the center within us, or which part within us aims at this concentrated growth? Become conscious of this. Which parts within you are more interested in the catching a little bit of the light and then spreading it out into your rest of your personality and its priorities and interests, engaging with lesser experiences. Notice these two. And then place them in context with each other. The form in which the mother recommends this exercise, she says, every evening you sit down, become conscious of your aspiration, and put everything that you have done in the day in relation to that. Just be aware. You don't have to change anything, just be aware. And you will notice certain things you did nourished your aspiration. Certain experiences you had helped you grow. Other things diluted or made you lose or turned away from the aspiration. Simply observe. Doing nothing else. And within a few days, a few weeks or months, you will find automatically your awareness shifts, priorities shift. The things which nourish now begin to be more prominent, more important for you. The things which dissipate, which you were not conscious were dissipating, now you realize somehow it's not so much interesting anymore, not so fun anymore. And they begin to have less importance, they begin to fade. Or their form changes so that they become more nourishing, more actively participating. Parts within you which were more peripheral begin to turn and orient towards the central aspiration, and all the changes begin to happen. If we look at ourselves as a group, as a people with many parts of consciousness, the same process which it describes in society is taking place in us. And that's why the microcosm and the macrocosm. And implied is the suggestion that as we change things within ourselves, it will reflect in our immediate life, in our immediate circle of relationships, and perhaps also within society and humanity, to whatever small degree. And in a sense, that's the best contribution you can make to help in humanity's spiritual awakening. We'll pause here and meditate on this for half a minute.